How are we doing tonight? Thank you, Mr. DeSalvo, for that very warm introduction. And thank you guys for coming tonight on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students, both at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and St. Anselm College. We really appreciate you coming out this evening. We really do. So without any further ado, how about some introductions? So tonight's program features author and former Congressman Joe Scarborough. Mr. Scarborough is the host of MSNBC's Morning Joe, ranked by the New York Times as one of today's top morning shows. Prior to his television career, Mr. Scarborough served as a member of Congress from 1994 to 2001, winning 4 consecutive elections with overwhelming support. While in office, he was a member of the Judiciary, Armed Services, Oversight, and National Security Committees. Mr. Scarborough is a 2-time New York Times best-selling author. His first work, Rome Wasn't Burnt in a Day, predicted the collapse of the Republican majority and the U.S. economy due to his party's reckless spending. His second book, The Last Best Hope, Restoring Conservatism and America's Promise, draws on the forgotten genius of conservatism to offer a roadmap for the movement and the country. Tonight, he will discuss his latest work, The Right Path, From Ike to Reagan, How Republicans Once Mastered Politics and Can Again. And tonight, Mr. Scarborough will be joined by Mr. Jon Meacham. Mr. Meacham is the current executive vice president at Random House, one of the largest general interest publishing companies in the world. He's a 2009 Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson and the White House. The book has since been known by author Douglas Brinkley as, quote, the most readable, single-volume biography ever written of our 7th president. Other works by Mr. Meacham include the New York Times best-selling novel, Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship, and American Gospel, God, Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joe Scarborough and Mr. Jon Meacham.
Congressman. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you. What do you want?
All right. Very good.
It's very generous. We were just reflecting that saying you're one of the best morning shows or the largest general interest book publisher is like saying you're the best restaurant in a hospital.
Yeah.
But we are the future, like you. So we are trying. Thank you all very much. I know this is the way you all spend most of your Friday nights. This is the way in the South, this is what we do. Usually we're in a place with sawdust on the floor, but so this is much higher brow than we're used to. But I had the great privilege of being Joe's editor on this book, and the book, which we want to talk about what's in it, and then what the reaction to it has been, because I think it's safe to say that both of us have been pleasantly surprised by the people who have reacted to it well, and where those folks are on the political spectrum. So we will do that. And then I just noticed we're in New Hampshire.
Are we really?
I know, it's odd. So we may get to something involving civic life here.
Right.
But first, what is the right path?
Well, I've been saying it for years, and I've written it in 3 books now, and I've been saying it in Washington and on TV for 20 years. And the right path, at least for the Republican Party. And it's a formula that's worked time and time again. And we had a certain United States senator who tried to explain this, but did so and somehow managed to insult a World War II vet in doing so. So I will be a bit more careful tonight. The right path is, at least for the Republican Party, electing somebody who's conservative ideologically. A small government conservative ideologically. But somebody who's moderate temperamentally. We haven't gotten that right of late. We have been nominating people who actually have it backwards. In fact, the Republican Party's image, I think its national image over the past 20 years, in a large part, has contributed to us getting routed across New England. After 2008, not having a single resident of New England represented by a Republican in the United States Congress. So the importance, I think it's very important to remember that you've got to have both of those things to win, because you do go back, and Ted Cruz, you know, it's so funny, the day after Ted Cruz was at CPAC and he was talking without a teleprompter for 30 minutes, everybody's like, wow, that's the greatest thing ever. Of course, we do that for 3 hours a day on TV and get paid very well for it. But I said, that is pretty impressive. No teleprompter or anything. But the point he tried to make, again, I think he made a mistake or two, but he was trying to say, go back and say, well, look what Republicans have won presidential elections and which ones have lost. Going back to 76, Gerald Ford lost, a moderate. Ronald Reagan won in 80, a landslide, a conservative. Won in 84, a conservative. Bush won in 88, promising no new taxes, as a conservative. Lost in 92 as a moderate after raising taxes. We had Bob Dole, a moderate, losing in 96. And then Bush campaigned as a conservative in 2000 and 2004. McCain lost in 8. Romney lost in 12. This is a pretty simple formula. It just is. You've got to be able to energize the base, but this is the important thing, and this is what Republicans have forgotten, is that you can't scare little kids and puppy dogs with your candidates when they come on TV in 30-second commercials. You know, John Huntsman, a guy who may not have been the greatest candidate on the face of the earth, but guess what? John Huntsman actually was a very conservative candidate. I mean, ideologically, Huntsman was as conservative as they came. Again, he didn't have all the political skills that he needed to win that election, but that's a pretty good model of somebody who's very conservative, but again, can appeal to swing voters. It's become, for some reason, a cardinal sin for Republicans to actually go out and be able to attract moderates and Democrats that once voted for Republicans. Now, at the end of my book, I decide I'm going to shake conservatives up. I'm a conservative, but I wanted to do this challenge. You know, we are Southerners. And, you know, as good Southern Baptists, at the end, the preacher makes a call. We sing Just As I Am for 45 verses until somebody comes to the front and joins the church with all eyes closed and all heads bowed. And we sing Just As I Am until somebody comes forward. So I decided to make my challenge to my conservative brethren and sisters and say, we're not going to start winning national elections again until we get somebody that can get both Ted Cruz's vote and Colin Powell's vote. And when I say we need Colin Powell's vote, you would think it was as if I were saying that we needed the endorsement of the Young Marxist League of Manhattan. Now, we could get that because Mika Brzezinski is a member of that league. We miss Mika tonight, don't we?
We do.
I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church. Mika was raised in a variety of Young Marxist League meeting houses across the greater Manhattan area. Right. That's another story.
That's right. But she is, in fact, the most powerful person on the planet.
Oh, so. She scares me. We call her Bar. You know, she has this routine she does on TV, and then she has, like, the real Mika, and it's a frightening specter. It really is.
But makes her father look soft.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
But people get upset when I say we need Colin Powell to vote for us, and a lot of times they'll go, but wait a second. Why do we need Colin Powell voting for our guy? He voted Democratic the last 2 elections. Yeah, that's right. We want the people that used to vote Republican, that are now voting Democratic, to come back home and vote Republican. And how do we do that? Well, like I said, we nominate people who are conservative ideologically, small government conservatives ideologically, moderate temperamentally. And let me give you a great example. I talk an awful lot about William F. Buckley. Buckley in '64 loved Barry Goldwater. He thought Goldwater was God's answer to Republican candidates. And then Goldwater got wiped out. And there were predictions, and John and I talked about this a lot, predictions that Goldwater's selection, because he was so ideological, would cause the destruction of the conservative movement and the Republican Party for a generation. 2 years later, another guy ran for governor of a really, really big state. And he took Barry Goldwater's platform and took it out to California. And he said it with a smile on his face. And he obsessed on figuring out how those conservative values didn't apply to people that read and ran, but applied to working class and middle class voters in California. And guess what? The same ideological platform that caused a massive landslide in '64, 2 years later, elected Ronald Reagan and started a conservative revolution that still shapes our political system today. Guess what? It does matter how you are temperamentally. It does matter how you present yourself to voters. It does matter if you actually care whether they like you or not, whether they can believe in you or not, whether they think you have their best interest at heart, or whether you're just an ideologue that's going to obsess over making sure you check off the list on every single ideological checklist that's put in front of you.
All right, let's start. The story of modern republicanism, to some extent, starts with Dwight Eisenhower, who's right there. He recognized reality. Comes to power in '52. He says any government, any administration that tries to undo Social Security, that tries to repeal the New Deal, right, it's on a glide path to disaster. It can't be done. He was a conservative in the sense that he took reality as he found it, right, and tried to reform it. He was not a revolutionary.
Which is what William F. Buckley said a conservative is. Right. They recognize the reality that's in front of them, and ideology becomes much more dangerous as it approaches reality. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you have Eisenhower at the beginning of the post-war era, and then Governor Reagan and President Reagan, who would say, I'd much rather get 60% of what I can do now and come back and get the 40% later. Joe and I talk about this a lot. I think I can say we think. The way to understand Ronald Reagan is not so much as an actor, but as a labor negotiator. Because when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, what did he do? He negotiated the main contract with Hollywood. He used to say, people think Brezhnev is tough, they should meet Jack Warner. You know, this was his whole thing. So he was a closet pragmatist. And no one ever, it used to amaze George H.W. Bush about how Ronald Reagan could make compromises all the time, and no one held him accountable for it. He was not a flip-flopper. He was doing the right thing. Eisenhower at the beginning, Reagan in the middle. What happened? That is, where did the party shift into this ideological thicket in which so much of it finds itself today?
Well, let's talk about Ike really quickly, because I'm glad you brought him up. Eisenhower had every conservative that elected him in 1952, because remember, this is the first time Republicans were in power in 20 years. FDR and Truman had owned the White House since 1932. Ike comes in, and conservatives said, he's got to get rid of the New Deal. He's got to abolish Social Security. And that's when Ike said, only a fool would do that. Dwight Eisenhower understood that by that time, 20 years later, Social Security was a part of the social fabric of America. And any Republican that tried to undo it would be voted out of office. Ronald Reagan I talk about Reagan in 64 and 66, rails against Medicaid and Medicare. And in fact, that famous moment where Reagan goes, there he goes again. That was a moment when Jimmy Carter said, Ronald Reagan's going to get rid of your Medicare. Reagan didn't. He made the calculation, like Ike had made in 1952, that if he tried to get rid of Medicare or weaken Social Security, he'd be voted out of office. So what did he do? He raised taxes, worked with Tip O'Neill, and saved Social Security in 1983. He made that calculation. Margaret Thatcher, another one of my political heroes. Thatcher, the Iron Lady, tough as hell. She stood down every labor union in Great Britain that she thought was destroying Great Britain at the time and took on fights that nobody believed she could have taken on. It's extraordinary what she did for Great Britain. But guess what? She never, ever dared touch their national health system. Because Thatcher told her allies, anybody that tries to touch that gets voted out of office. And because Thatcher knew what fights to fight and what fights not to fight, she was the longest-serving conservative prime minister of Great Britain in the 20th century. So where have Republicans gone wrong? I'm not so sure. I personally think George W. Bush should have fought a little bit more on economic issues. I think he should have been a little more conservative. When I left Congress in 2001, we had a $155 billion surplus. When George W. Bush left the White House in 2009, we had a $1 trillion deficit. Our national debt doubled. We Republicans passed a Medicare drug benefit plan that cost $7 trillion. We didn't fund a dime of it. We fought wars across the globe, Wilsonian military adventurism. We cut taxes. We did everything all at once. You've got to make choices if you're a conservative. And we didn't do that. I think we lost part of our way there, and I think what you saw in 2010, 2011, 2012, even 2013 was a reaction to big government republicanism. And I think that went too far in the other direction. I mean, the whole government shutdown this past fall was just a slow-motion train wreck. People like Charles Krauthammer, Scott Walker, and myself, for about 3 or 4 months, were going, no, as the train slowly went there. And of course, there were people on talk radio going, you're rhino, rhino. You know, and we actually saw the party tear in two. Not over ideology. I'm against Obamacare as much as Ted Cruz is against Obamacare. But it was about tactics. It was about tactics. It was, like you said, Reagan said, I'll get 60% now, I'll come back and try to get the 40% later. They tried to get everything all at once, and it was a disaster, and it hurt the Republican Party. So I think a lot of our problems, John, haven't been as ideological as it's been that we've nominated in Senate races, and also we saw in the presidential primary, several years ago, just rank amateurs. Yeah. People that didn't know what they were doing. People that would go on and do 30-second ads and say, I am not a witch. This is not the way to win back the Senate. It's not. Right.
Moving into the Clinton era, what can the Republicans learn from Bill Clinton's success?
Get impeached and have your approval rating double? I don't know.
That would be good for all of us.
I'm still trying to figure that one out. How do you do what that guy does and have your approval rating go up to 60%? That guy drove me crazy. I'd see him on TV and be like, I feel your pain. I'd be like, he's lying. You know he's lying. I mean, how many of you, and I'm sure a lot of you, how many of you have had a chance to meet Bill Clinton? Raise your hand. Come on.
Actually, raise your hand if you haven't.
Yeah, exactly. There's a thing about Bill Clinton. The guy, seriously, it's like straight out of a Beach Boys song. He gets around. You ask most audiences, how many of you met Bill Clinton? And unless you're in New Hampshire, 2 or 3 people will raise their hands. You can go to any cafeteria at Walmart. You'll have half the people. Oh, I met him. He was here last week. But
he's still here.
He's still here. The first time I met this guy, I couldn't stand him. I mean, you know, the first time I met this guy, I was going into the White House after campaigning against him nonstop. And I was like, I can't believe I got to meet this guy. You know, I turn around and look at him, and there he is. You know, the first time you meet him, guy looks like he's about 8'4". He looks like Mutombo on those Geico commercials, knocking down, right? He's huge. He's huge. You know, and so there, you know, the second time you meet him, he looks about 7'3". The third time I met him, I was like, I got a couple inches on this guy. But the first time you meet him, he's like staring at you, and you're staring at him, and he said, hey, it's Joe Scarborough. I turned around to my wife, and I was like, he knows my name, the president. And then he came over, and he said, I sure would like to go to Pensacola. I haven't been there since 1969. I'm like, would you? And his hands are all over you, as you know, because he's Bill Clinton. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. He's just it's a very seductive. Very seductive. I was seduced. I went home that night. I was like Lady Macbeth trying to get the stain out, and it wouldn't come out. But I felt bad about hating him as much as I did. I remember telling Erskine Bowles, who's a good friend of mine, and he was the chief of staff at the time, I said, Erskine, I love you, man. I love you, but I can't stand your boss. And Erskine said, don't worry about it, Congressman. He hates you too. And he did. But guess what? I was talking about how style matters, substance matters, but style matters too. If you're putting on a production of Hamlet and you can choose from all the actors who have ever acted in the history of film, would you choose Groucho Marx or Laurence Olivier? It makes a difference. You can read the same lines, right? But Ronald Reagan reads them better, you know, delivers them better than Barry Goldwater did. And it made a difference. I'm not talking also about shallow politics. I'm really not. I have found, and I'm sure you all have found, because you've had a front row seat to history every 4 years, that a lot of times the style and the substance goes together for a reason. Because the people you relate to are people who actually give a damn about you. Who actually are not, you know, we, for some reason, have nominated some really weird people. And I'm not gonna name their names. Every 4 years, you've met them, but just stiff, awkward people.
It's not really that hard to...
It's not really that hard to go back, and I know. You go, wow, is that the best we got?
Right.
But there are some that really know how to connect and really know how to take their ideas and their beliefs and their values and connect them to the voters and explain how they think they can make voters' lives better. Bill Clinton could do that. Ronald Reagan could do that. I think right now Barack Obama's having a terrible time doing that because we've talked about this before, and we've talked about it for a long time, and we've talked about it in non-ideological settings. Barack Obama doesn't like Washington. He doesn't like politics, and we're not even sure if he likes people that much.
It is a very strange career choice.
It is a strange career. Seriously,
Yeah.
I'm not saying he doesn't like people, but I don't know that he loves being in the business of dealing with people.
Well, the greatest presidents have always either loved the job or faked it really, really well. Franklin Roosevelt used to relax by trying to figure out who should be the postmaster in Akron. I mean, that's what, you know, Lyndon Johnson would pour a glass of Cuddy Sark, God help us, on Saturday nights and call Texas courthouses trying to find out who had had a school board election that week and just how people had done. Clinton can still tell you his vote totals county by county in Arkansas from 78 forward.
Right.
There was and it's not just sort of an ESPN of politics. I don't think it's that. But I think there's something intuitive in the American soul, really, that we want people who are in charge of our affairs to actually want to be in charge of our affairs. And
we haven't really had that the last two presidents. I mean, you know, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. You know, we're not so sure they loved being there that much. Right. George W. Bush never looked back.
Right.
Barack Obama, if he could leave town right now, he'd be gone. He would. Bill Clinton?
He's still there.
We couldn't get, do you remember the inauguration? You know, George W. Bush about to be sworn in. Bill Clinton is still like, hey, how are y'all doing? Hey, now I'm back here. Bill Clinton wouldn't leave town. He loved it. And by the way, I'm not making fun of him. That's what you want. You want a guy that, I mean, Clinton was up at midnight, still making phone calls, obsessing over legislation.
Pardoning.
Pardoning people at the end. Mark Rich. I mean, come on. Let's be high-minded here.
Oh, sorry.
Let's elevate the... But you are right, though. There has been a disconnect over the last 8 years or so.
So as you look forward, the key ingredients for great presidents, great political movements, let's just go with the post-war era, but it goes back farther, is a sense of optimism. We want to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. People don't win by running on the past, which really hurts me in what I do. But optimism, a joy in the job. Right. You want, if you're hiring someone to be president, you want them to be enthusiastic about the task. And also smartly balancing the Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian traditions. Right. Active government, limited government. So that at our best, government has created the conditions for private prosperity. Mm-hmm. So if you look at these things, if you look at optimism, energy, and making the public sector work, not just dismissing it altogether or embracing it in an unnuanced way, put those things together into a platform, a ethos for today.
Well, I mean, it certainly is a balance. I want to start with your first item, though. Optimism is extraordinarily important because we've seen it in our own life. I don't mean to sound like a motivational speaker, but I've said it to all 4 of my kids, and I found it to be the case in my life. I wake up every morning thinking I can do whatever I want to do. And I think I live in a country where if I wake up earlier than everybody else, and I go to sleep later than everybody else, and I work harder than everybody else, it may not matter that I'm not smarter than everybody else. Over time, and I found this to be the case, good things will come my way. Now, I've got to say, this sense of optimism is something I haven't seen in Washington, and I'm sick and tired of hearing Democrats, when a Republican's in the White House, suggesting that the greatness of America has passed us by. And I'm equally sick and tired of hearing people in my own party saying every time a Democratic bill passes that this is the end of America as we know it. How many times have we heard, freedom died tonight? Freedom died again tonight. I mean, how many times could freedom die? Let the word go forth to my Republican brethren that this country is strong enough to even survive 8 years of Barack Obama. Do you know why I say that? Because my political idol in college was Ronald Reagan. And something happened in college. I don't know what happened, but I accidentally started making good grades. This is something that had never happened to me before. So when I got a call at the University of Alabama to go visit the dean of the history school, I went in there and I was like, God, what did I do now? And I was like doing the checklist in my head. How did I screw up? And I went in, the dean said, hey, we're going to give you a scholarship. Swear to God, I said, for what? I said, well, Joe, you've made all A's in history courses over 3.5 years. And so I said, that's great. And so, you know, he said, I want to take you out to lunch and talk. So we went out and had lunch talk, and I asked him, and I was a little nervous, but I asked him, I said, so what do you think of Ronald Reagan? And he sat there, and the smile just evaporated from his face, and he said to me, He said, well, measuring his words very carefully in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1985, he said, well, I think America's strong enough to survive even 8 years of Ronald Reagan. And I was horrified. It took me a while to figure it out, but as I moved away from that moment, it hit me, you know, that just how different we are as a country and how differently people can look at the same person, at the same party. And that's why I always say to my Republican brothers and sisters, and when I wrote a book in 2009, at the beginning of the Obama administration, basically the book's message was simple. And I'll be careful with how I say it. Let's keep our stuff together. Let's do 3 things that we failed at doing during the Bush administration. 1, let's be conservative at home, show restraint at home, and spend less money and start balancing budgets. 2, show restraint abroad. Stop fighting wars all over the globe. Stop engaging in military adventurism. And the 3rd message, show restraint in your rhetoric. Show respect for the president. Whether you agree with him or whether you disagree with him, show respect. Now let me tell you, this last part is what Americans yearn for. It really is. Meek and I have gone around, we've given probably 400, 500 speeches over the past 4 or 5 years. And we deliver the same speech everywhere. Whether it's at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, one of the most liberal places you could hope to find in America, or whether it's, John, did you turn off your cell phone? That's mine. Whether it's at the 92nd, Meek is calling me saying, don't call that place liberal.
It's Ted Cruz.
Oh, okay. So whether we're delivering a message at the 92nd Street Y or whether we are delivering a message at Pat Robertson's University, Regent University, you'd be stunned. The reaction's always the same. And you know what I always say at the end? I say we shouldn't root against our president, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, because you can't root against the president without rooting against the country. My grandmother taught me growing up that you should actually pray for the president. And I saw my grandmom pray for Jimmy Carter. And if you can pray for Jimmy Carter, you can pray for anybody. It's a joke. It's better when Meek is here.
Yeah.
But you know what?
I can roll my
When
eyes.
I said that at Regent University, Pat Robertson's University in Central Virginia in 2010, when Barack Obama's approval ratings were at their lowest, do you know what Pat Robertson's students did? Gave us a standing ovation. You can fight like hell for what you believe in and still show respect to the other side. I think that's critical. And I think that's a big part of what Americans want. And I think we've got a great opportunity moving forward. We really do. This country, if Washington will just do a few things right, I promise you, speaking of optimism, we're on the verge of an economic renaissance, the likes of which you wouldn't believe. We've got an energy revolution coming up. Even the Chinese admit we have 8 of the top 10 universities on the planet. We have entered into what Tom Friedman calls the talent age. We've got the CEO of General Electric, Jeff Immelt, a good friend, saying that outsourcing was a bad idea, that it's time to bring those manufacturing jobs home because you can build it here faster, you can build it here better, you can ship it out faster, you can get the order in, faster and get it out to the people faster here in the United States. I think we're going to see over the next 10 years, if Washington does a few things right, I think you're going to see an economic explosion. And we have reasons to be optimistic.
Let's talk about the impact of the book, because published last fall, it made a unconventional case. You are a conservative arguing for a moderate temperament, not a moderate ideology, and that's very hard to explain to folks sometimes who don't want to hear, who don't want to understand. But talk about the people who've reacted to it, and then I think we need to discuss, I've heard a rumor or two that you might be here not just to spend Friday night with me, but you might be in New Hampshire for other possible reasons.
I heard it was snowing up here. I'm going to go skiing.
Good.
Up at Bretton Woods.
Good.
Tired of skiing Vermont. I mean, I want to come here where you have real snow.
Howard Dean threw you out.
Yeah, Howard Dean threw me out, exactly. Thank God.
The book, reaction.
The reaction's actually been very positive. I've been surprised when I've put out books in the past. In 2004, all the way back in 2004, I was criticizing George W. Bush for spending too much and trying to do too much and engaging in a Wilsonian foreign policy. Republicans didn't want to hear that in 2004. Now, in 2010, they started saying the same exact thing. So I went from being rhino to a prophet in like 6 years. That's a pretty good turnaround, right?
Yeah.
How long does it take to be a saint in the Catholic Church? I mean, it takes a while.
You have to grow in office.
You have to grow in office. So
for the New York Times, that means you actually come to agree with the New York Times.
Yeah, exactly. So that was 6 years. My second book in 2009 upset Republicans because I was actually talking about, again, restraint at home, restraint abroad, and restraint in rhetoric. And big government republicanism is as bad as big government liberalism. They didn't want to hear that either. So I expected when we put this book out to have a lot of sort of the movement conservatives that criticized my last two books to do it again. It just didn't happen. It didn't happen because this book obsesses over how we win moving forward, the right path forward to winning. Republicans have lost 5 of the last 6 presidential campaigns when it came to the popular vote. We've got to examine ourselves, and I think there are a lot of people that recognize that all of my dire warnings over the past 20 years actually came true, and that we've got to find a new way forward. So I think that had a lot to do with it. I think another thing is after 20 years of talking about this formula over and over and over again, that we elect somebody who's conservative ideologically but moderate temperamentally, I think that message is finally breaking through as well. And it's about time. So I think it's kind of nice to actually get positive comments from
your own team.
Some of the most hardcore people on my own team. Because it is, at the end of the day, it's about winning. You can't change America if you can't win elections. And I think it's really important that we change America for the right reasons.
Speaking of elections, there's one coming up in 2016.
There's one coming up in 2014, actually.
There is.
It's a big one.
I'm looking ahead. I'm a fortune teller.
Okay.
Are you interested in running?
Okay, so I've been asked this question.
Really?
And let me say it this way.
I'm not the first?
You're not the first. I don't want to break your heart here. But I don't know. I've always said I wanted to get back into public office. I got some attention on Hugh Hewitt's show when he asked if I definitely, if I'd give the Sherman-esque, I definitely will not run in 2016. I'm not going to say that. I always keep all options open. I've looked at running for the Senate in the past, but right now I'm at a pretty good place. I've got a 10-year-old daughter that has told me that I can't run until she gets out of high school. I think she's going to have to compromise with Daddy. I guess I'm not waiting 8 years. I can tell you that. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. When I ran in 1994, I ran for a reason. I was 30 years old. I had no money. I had no name ID. Nobody knew who I was. I basically blew up a law firm. I had just started the year before. Nobody thought I was going to win. I even told my dad, because no Republican had won in my district since 1873. And they hung the last one that they sent to Washington, so it's a tough district. And I remember telling my dad I was going to run against Earl Hutto, who's a 16-year Democrat. And my dad goes, well, that's great, Joey, but I'm voting for Earl. Seriously? But I went ahead and did it. It didn't make a lot of sense. I'm not one of these guys that writes a list, the pros and the cons. I never do that. I operate by gut, and my guts never let me down. But I did decide to do it that time. And I had about 30 cons and 1 pro. And the 1 pro was, I need to do it because it's the right thing for me to do. And I did. I really did believe that we needed to check Bill Clinton, who in '93 and '94 had taken the country really far left. And so I'll see. But if I make the decision, it's not going to be based on a calculation of whether, you know, unfortunately, a lot of people decide to run because they want to sell books.
Yeah.
Or they want to get TV contracts.
Right.
Or they want to make money. Check, check, check. I'm good with that.
Right.
Right?
Right. Right.
If I do it, I would do it for 2 reasons. 1, because I didn't think anybody could beat Hillary, and 2, because I think I could. It's the only reason.
Okay. We want to go to y'all with your questions. We have microphones. A microphone, I guess. Sir, right behind you, there's a microphone.
People on this side of the room are out of luck. You guys just shout. Shout it out.
Just to follow up, Joe, on what you were saying, I think it's a great comment about the rhetoric that you made. But what bothers me, and I've been around for a lot of presidents, why is Obama personally hated so much?
Well, I think you have to go back to 1992. Something happened when Bill Clinton got elected president. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it's new media. Maybe it was a lot of other cable news networks coming online, talk radio. The internet started 2 or 3 years later. But, you know, I remember a book being written, Blood Sport. Politics is Blood Sport. It was
James Stewart.
James Stewart wrote the book. And through the Clinton administration, and you know what? I was a part of it for the first couple of years I was in Washington, 95 and 96. Politics was a blood sport. We were after Bill Clinton, and it was ugly. And a lot of people will say today, it's never been worse than it is today with Barack Obama. You weren't there in 94 and 95 when Jerry Falwell was sending around the Clinton Chronicles saying these are the 17 people that Bill Clinton killed.
Murder, yeah.
He murdered. I mean, we were rough on that guy. And he'd be like, hey, you want to go golf? It drove us crazy. And then George W. Bush was elected. And for 8 years, you know, Democrats, they've got amnesia. How could you do this to our guy? We never did anything like this to Bush. I was living on the Upper West Side. I swear to God, you go to Starbucks, you walk outside of Starbucks, and there'd be all of these tables with pictures of George W. Bush dressed as Adolf Hitler on one, Mussolini on another, and Stalin on another. You know, Harry Reid and everybody say, I think Republicans really mishandled the Russia situation early on. There are a couple of people that came out and said some things that they shouldn't have said. They've shown restraint now. But for Democrats to be so horrified, how could they speak ill of our commander-in-chief when he's in a showdown with Putin? Harry Reid called George W. Bush, when George W. Bush was visiting Putin in Russia, a loser and a liar. And I could go on and on and on and on. And it's a he said, she said, she said, he said. So what I'm telling you is, the first part of that is, we've lived in a political culture since 1992 where the second a president is elected, the other side works around the clock to delegitimize him. And think about this. You know what the impact of that has been? The re-election of 3 presidents for the first time since the 1820s? Historian?
No.
Oh, come on. You know what, Meacham? I'm paying you to be up here. Well, no,
Where?
hold on a second.
What?
I know. Well, here.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm paying you a mug of water. No, I think you have to go back to Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe.
Right.
Okay, when was that?
That was in the 1800s and 18-teens. We're at St. Anselm.
I get into the 20s, right? We get in. Okay, so I'm going back to the beginning of the 1800s, and I'm off by 2 years, and Jon Meacham is busting me for that.
Just say in the early republic.
So here's the bigger point. It does two things, actually. By trying to delegitimize the president, one, it causes the sclerosis in Washington, so nothing happens. But two, the overreaction always ends up helping the target of that hatred. And at some point, the political parties are going to figure this out. Again, think about it. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, all three reelected after facing the most extreme withering criticism from the other side for 8 years straight.
Yeah.
Next question.
Question. Here we go.
I hate to take issue with the comment, but when Bill Clinton got elected president, the destruction machine was against him on day one. When George Bush was elected president, that did not happen at all. A lot of Democratic congressmen and senators worked with George Bush on legislation and did not try to defeat his every initiative from day one, as the Republicans have done with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. That's a point of view from one New Hampshire citizen. So I don't see the comparison at all. I think the brutality against Obama has been much worse than ever against George Bush. Bush, it got a lot worse when the war started. That sometimes happens when we go to an unpopular war, as it did with Lyndon Johnson. But the comparison, to me, falls real short of what's going on by today's conservative Republicans.
The only thing I would say is go on Google tonight, and I will be very careful how I say this. Pull up the transcripts of a certain cable news network night after night after night after night after night. In fact, you can just pull up the transcript of a former ESPN reporter who worked on a certain political network night after night after night after night. And I will guarantee you, you will be shocked by what was said repeatedly.
I'm talking about elected officials, not the press and not members.
Well, I think when you have the top Democrat in the United States Senate calling the commander-in-chief a loser and a liar when he's negotiating with Vladimir Putin, I think that's pretty harsh. Now, listen, I've got the microphone, so it's not really fair. And we could have a back and forth about this. I take your point, and I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem on both sides. And when I'm talking to a strictly Republican crowd, they'll say, Joe, how could you say that after Democrats said blah, da, 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 about whatever? The fact is we've got a problem in this country. We've forgotten how to talk to each other. We've forgotten how to disagree with each other and still show respect. And I think that's the bigger point. And I think at some point, political parties will realize what goes around comes around. And they need to understand, and Republicans need to understand, there won't be a Democrat in the Oval Office forever, even though sometimes it seems like we're working toward that end.
Can I throw one thing in here? Historically, partisanship is part of the oxygen. We're always going to disagree on opinions. Right. Jefferson once said, men have divided themselves into parties over whether the interests of the many or the interests of the few should predominate since those questions convulsed Greece and Rome. So it's been going on a while. The distinction in what Joe writes about really, really well is reflexive partisanship. That is, do I disagree with whatever you say because you're saying it? And that's what has remarkably taken stronger root and flowered more in the last 30 years or so. I just had a conversation a couple weeks ago with Lamar Alexander, who knows the state well. He first ran for office 40 years ago in Tennessee for governor. And I asked him what's changed most in that biblical 40 years. And he said it was the speed and rapidity and just reflexivity of the opposition. That is, we used to have a news cycle of at least a day. A couple of hours now seems like Gibbon. It's just remarkable. But we're in a system where it's hypercritical, and the partisan culture rewards speed, predictability, and hyperbole. Right? You don't get much traction if you're in a position like Joe's and saying, well, I'm of two minds about that.
You also don't have the space to compromise.
Right.
Ed Rendell and I, who don't agree on a lot, but in 2009, we were talking to a Philadelphia crowd, and people said, well, why can't the two sides just get together and come up with a health care plan that'll suit both sides? And Ed and I both said, well, listen, we disagree with each other, but we could go in a back room, and 3 or 4 hours, we could hammer it out. And we could make sure that Joe would get what Joe wanted, which would be to make sure that, the market forces would be protected, and it wouldn't run up a big debt, and we could get what Ed wanted, which was to make sure that there was at least a minimum standard of care for America's most disadvantaged, and we could figure out a way to do that and get a bill passed that wouldn't start World War III. The problem is, because of what John's talking about, the second somebody saw Ed Rendell and I walk into a room, it would be on the Huffington Post and the Drudge Report in 3 minutes, and the phone calls would start streaming into both of our offices immediately, and our staff members would rush us out of the room, and the negotiations would stop. There isn't that space, unfortunately,
that's a good word for it.
With politicians. I will say, at some point, public figures have to just stop looking at Twitter. Their mentions on Twitter, I mean, seriously? Or the blogs, the Cheetos Brigade, as I call them, that are just constantly churning, trying to bring more people to their website, sitting in their mom's basement in underwear, hoping that this is going to be the story that shocks America enough to break their blog through to the national consciousness. At some point, if you're worried about what people are saying about you on Twitter, you probably don't deserve a seat in Congress anyway. I tell you, I have no idea. At this stage, I just really have. I've been a public figure for 20 years. At this stage, if you want to upset me, don't waste your time on Twitter or writing a blog, because chances are good, unless I'm talking about sports or music, I'm not going there to see what you're saying, because it has gotten so hateful. It's just this spin machine that, like you said, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
Tim. Yes.
So I think the most interesting thing that I've seen in politics the last 40 years is how quick, an issue that moved the fastest is gay rights. And you talk about this line of Republicans, and Reagan was able to say be against abortion, maybe the majority support it. But as I look at this generational gap, I really wonder if the prescription you got really fits that. If there really isn't something pretty profoundly different between people over 65 and people under 30. And maybe that's why we have the conflict in politics that we do. Because it's really generation arguing with generation. I will say as an aside, the fact that impeachment has become part of the general vocabulary of activists is a really bad thing.
Yeah.
And the Republicans adapted Clinton, and they also talk relatively frequently about that with Obama. Mm-hmm. I don't remember Democrats doing that before.
We'll Google that tonight.
Yeah, they did. They did.
They did. Yeah, I don't know. We also had guys running for the Senate that tried to redefine rape. We had some problems, okay? We've had some problems that we've gotten passed in the Republican Party. You know it's a problem when you wake up the day after the election and somebody asks you, how did the rape candidate do? And you have to go, which one? They both lost. Now, listen, I love this question. I love your question. You're talking about gay rights, talking about same-sex marriage, and this is why I love the question. Because when I got elected to Washington in 1994, I was sure that all of America had turned conservative overnight. This was our time. Let the streets flow with the blood of the unbelievers. This is our time. And then we got slapped down 2 years later because we went too far right. Just like Bill Clinton had gotten slapped down because he went too far left. What I love about this question is it underlines the fact that Americans are not ideological. Hey, you've got to let me finish. Now, when I go, Americans aren't ideological. Hold on. You got to let a line like that breathe, my man. What's wrong with you? I can tell I'm going to have to stand up and preach now. Why do I say Americans aren't ideological? And please, don't interrupt, or my thugs in the back are going to pull you out. Americans aren't ideological because take two of the most divisive social issues of the day. One, gay rights, same-sex marriage, right? It's breaking left, traditionally left. And then abortion, the second most divisive issue of the day. And it has been since 1973. Guess what? Americans are becoming more, quote, conservative on that issue. Why? Is it because of ideology? Is it because of what people in Washington, D.C. are saying? Is it because the National Right to Life League is putting out great 30-second commercials that are moving people? No. It's because when moms and dads go into hospitals to look at their unborn children, they see 3D imaging, and they can actually go in and see what their child's going to look like. I know I look old, but I've got a 5-year-old boy. It was a shock to me too, sir. It was a shock to me too. Sometimes I look at him like, he's my grandson. But, you know, one of the earliest ultrasounds, we looked in, and I could see the shape of his nose. And, you know, when I put him to bed last night, I still saw the shape of his nose that I saw in that 3D imaging. And guess what? That just makes Americans a bit more wary of abortion. Because of ideology? No. It's practical. And what's happened with gay marriage? What's happened with gay rights? Guess what? We've all had people who are gay come into our lives. And they came into our lives without horns on the top of their heads. And they didn't take off our children and molest them. You know, all these crazy things. They didn't take us out in the back in the alley and beat us up. You know, there is a generational divide. There's no doubt about it. But what we found is that when you debate an issue like adoption, should gay couples be able to adopt? You have conservatives looking around at their own family and going, wow, if something happened to me, I don't know that I'd want any of my family taking care of my kids. But they know a gay couple that just might be better parents. And again, I'm just talking about street by street, county by county, community by community. These are the sort of things that move people. And over time, Americans have become, I think, more libertarian on that issue. So I don't know that it's a great generational divide. I just think it's practical. And on the issue of gay marriage, Americans are like, why not? So now you can interrupt me. because there's sort of an awkward pause. Sort of an awkward landing there.
As a Floridian former Baptist, I would say that, in 04, everybody thought that this was the wedge issue. They put it as a referendum in Florida.
Right.
And they ran it across.
And it worked in 04.
It did. So what I find interesting about it is not necessarily the issue itself, although that's interesting, is how quickly.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I've never seen an issue this divisive move this quickly in one direction.
Take a step back and say, well, what does that say about politics? Are opinions as deeply held now as they were 20 or 30 years ago? In other words, is there more volatility in people's ideology?
Well, no, I think Americans were much more willing to go to war in 2001 after, decades of not fighting a hot war. Well, actually after a decade of not fighting a hot war. Other than the first Gulf War, we hadn't engaged in a lot of wars. 10 years later, Americans are pragmatic. We look at what's happening in Syria, and Americans don't want to go into Syria. If Iran gets the bomb, Americans don't want to go into Iran. You look what's happening in Ukraine right now. It's the same thing. Again, I think it goes back to how pragmatic Americans are. And I don't know that all of our politics is that volatile because, again, when I go around, I've talked, again, 400, 500 groups over the past several years, I find most people agree with me. We need to figure out a way at some point to get closer to balancing our budget. We need to figure out a way at some point to stop fighting wars all over the globe. We've got to figure out at some point, and I said this 2-3 years ago, we've got to figure out at some point how to stop spending $2 billion a week in Afghanistan in a war that should have been over in 2010. We've got to invest in education. I say it as a Republican. We've got to invest in R&D. I say it as a Republican. We need to invest in education. I say it as a Republican. But we don't need to invest in school districts where Bill de Blasio runs school districts. We've got to invest in a way that we're making sure it's wise investments. So I actually see a consensus, a big consensus that you would never see if all you did was watch cable news at night or listen to talk radio or read blogs.
Yeah. I react to this. I would argue that politics is inherently volatile. In the next 50 years, the same amount of time that separates us from John Kennedy, so on one level it seems like a long time ago, on another level it wasn't. Two things are going to happen. We're going to become a majority-minority nation in terms of ethnicity, and we're going to become a minority Protestant nation for the first time. And these are two big cultural shifts that whoever is going to lead us has to be, I think, nimble in the same way the leaders we've been talking about actually were pretty nimble. I mean, you think about what happened in the civil rights movement, what happened in the women's movement. The country changed radically in the last 40 years, even before quite right, the shift in the opinion polling on the same-sex question.
But a lot of people see the demographic changes as challenges to the Republican Party. I just don't.
It's an opportunity.
I think it's a great opportunity. I think the Republican Party's problem is that too many people that have been running the Republican Party really do believe in the 47% theory. Really do believe that their ideology helps 47% of Americans. Don't believe like Ronald Reagan believed, like Margaret Thatcher believed, the shopkeeper's daughter believed, like I believe, that our conservative values, that our belief in less taxes, less regulation, less government interference in small businesses actually leads to prosperity for most Americans, and that what we believe is every bit as relevant to an 18-year-old Latino in South Central LA as it is to a 65-year-old white hedge fund broker in Greenwich, Connecticut. In fact, I believe it's more relevant to the 18-year-old Latino in South Central LA. Because the hedge fund broker in Greenwich, Connecticut, he's going to be able to afford his lawyers, and he's going to be able to afford his accountants, and he's going to figure out a way to pay a 17% tax rate while his secretary pays a 28% tax rate, which I think is obscene. So I don't, you know, I hear a lot of Republicans when the doors are closed saying we're doomed because of the demographic changes. I see it as great opportunities. And I see it as great opportunities also because America's getting old. Let me ask, how many baby boomers do we have here? Raise your hands. Be proud. Be proud. Come on, man. Woodstock, you were the scourge of humanity. Keep them up. The scourge of humanity. In the 60s, you gave us Woodstock. In the 70s, you gave us disco and polyester. The 90s, you gave us Bill Clinton. I could stop there, but now you're going to bankrupt us. And it's all down to numbers, and this is how the demographics should be on the Republican Party side. You know, when FDR passed Social Security, life expectancy was 62. You got your first check when you turned 65. Now, as a small government conservative, this is a Ponzi scheme that even I could live with. You pay into us your entire life, and then you die before you get your first check.
He was a genius.
Now, I'm not good with math. I went to the University of Alabama. But you don't have to be good at math there because usually we only have to count to number 1. But anyway, roll Tide. Roll Tide. The arrogance trips even in New Hampshire. But those numbers add up. But unfortunately, we all started living longer. And by the 50s, there were 15 people working for every one person on Social Security. Today, there are 3 people working for every one person on Social Security. Soon, there will be 2 people working for every one person on Social Security and Medicare. Those numbers don't add up. And it seems to me that the party that faces down those challenges in making sure that we keep those systems solvent and we take care of our long-term debt while taking care of our most disadvantaged people, that will be the party that will be rewarded. I don't know how many of you saw, and I'll be really quickly here, but this goes down to the demographics breakdown. I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times profile on Wendy Davis, the gubernatorial candidate, New York Times profile. But she was saying, well, you know, there are 4 groups you have to worry about, and she divided all of them up. And how do you deliver a message to Hispanics 22 to 38 and whites from 40 to, I mean, and it just made me dizzy. I got one message. My party should have one message to all Americans. And that is, we're going to do everything we can to help you pursue the American dream. And we believe, whether you're an 18-year-old Hispanic in South Central LA or a hedge fund broker in Greenwich, Connecticut, you want the same things for your family. You want your children to do better than you did. You want to be able to work hard, play by the rules, and when you retire, have a decent lifestyle, have a decent standard of living. And you want a government that works. I see the demographic challenges actually as a great opportunity. And I hope the Republican Party does too.
Do one more here.
We need to do rapid fire here. And here's my problem. I've got a 3-hour show, so and I don't have Mika here to stop me. You know, she usually she rolls her eyes, and I just keep going on. So could you do me a favor and start rolling your eyes when I talk too much?
I've already done that.
Okay. All right. There you go. Here you go. Here, hold on a second.
My question is...
Will you do me a favor, sir? Can you answer her question? Go ahead.
Okay, I want to know what you think about the influence of money in the political system and what you would do about it.
I'm against it. How's that?
That's not quite good enough.
Why do you think that's? You were tough. You were tough. You know, when Mika's off, if you could come and co-host with me, I'd really appreciate it. Might have to cut her mic, though, Meacham. Might have to cut her mic. You know, I'll tell you, I've got a problem with the fact that you can have 1 or 2 millionaires bankroll a candidate that changes really the course of a presidential campaign. We saw that happen last time. And so there have been some rule changes. I think they're going to have to do some further rule changes to stop that from happening, especially in presidential primaries. I do think, though, that for me, and I've said this on TV, and I've believed this since I was in Washington, D.C., I've seen too many politicians figure out how to get around every campaign finance law. The more complex it is, the more complicated it is, the more lawyers come in, the more they figure out a way to game the system and actually hide the money. For me, it's a libertarian approach. I don't know that you'd agree with it. I want full disclosure. I want full transparency, and I want it immediately. So you give what you want to give to the candidate that you want to give it to. But before it even gets to the candidate, the check is scanned, and, you know, the candidate gets it, and they put it up on their website immediately. And so I know the day the check is written where the money's coming from, and it doesn't come from corporations, and it doesn't come from third parties. It comes from the individuals who are supporting the candidate themselves. It's because right now it's a shell game. It's an absolute shell game. And the third-party attacks that completely distorted the 2012 Republican primaries, absolutely obscene. Was that short enough, Meacham?
That was okay.
She didn't roll her eyes.
No, right here, I promise this.
Yes.
My question is tied into that one. What I think, to me, there's another thing that's become the biggest problem is how long sorry. I'll use the mic now.
It's a tough crowd, all right.
My biggest thing is the length of time that they can stay in office. I mean, the president has term limits. What's your opinion on term limits for the senators, the representatives, and quite frankly, the Chief Justice, the justice on the Supreme Court? I find it hard to believe someone in their 80s is going to be making the best decisions. And I'm getting close to the age, but I don't think they're at this time, you know, and they're on there forever and ever. There should be limit.
You're getting close to 80? I need your exercise regimen.
My husband's a dermatologist. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. I need it. I knew there was a reason I came here, Meacham. I need just a little, tight. It needs to be tightened up just a little bit right here.
Just a little.
You know, I've always said, because people will ask, what's the one thing you would do if you could do one thing, pass one law after being in Congress for 4 terms? I always say term limits. And the reason I say term limits are simple. There were a small group of us that went after Newt Gingrich when it was a very dangerous, stupid thing to do. And every time we went after Newt Gingrich because he started spending money too much and he stopped being the Newt that was going to fight for the balanced budget and was going to fight for this and fight for that. When we started going after Newt, after about the 3rd or 4th meeting of being threatened and being screamed at and being told that I was going to be drummed out of Congress, I started looking to my left and looking to my right, and the 11 members that were always with me in that room had one thing in common. We had term limited ourselves. I said I was only going to be there 8 years. Mark Sanford had said it'd only be there 6 years. Matt Salmon said it'd only be there for 6 years. And I could go down the list. Tom Coburn in the House said he was only going to be in the House for 6 years. Steve Largent, the same. And I realized that we were in there because we weren't playing the long game. We weren't worried about offending a speaker who then wouldn't let us get on the right committee, and then 10 years later would let us be a subcommittee chair, and then 10 years later would let us be the chairman of the committee, and then 10 years later, maybe after 40 years in Congress, be Sam Rayburn and be the Speaker of the House. So I think term limits are absolutely essential. And I would personally do 8 years in the House and 12 years in the Senate. What do you think? All right.
This gentleman.
Yes.
I
Wait, before they turn on you with the microphone.
Thank you. Sorry.
It's the Oxbow incident.
Yeah. Maybe on that point about the competitiveness or lack thereof within the House specifically, with these districts that are, what, 10% of them are actually competitive. What would you do about that, or can we do anything about that?
Well, I think actually 10% competitive. I actually think that number may be a little high. There are about 30 seats right now out of 435 that are competitive. There's a higher turnover rate in the old Soviet Politburo than there is, seriously, than there is in our House of Representatives. And the fact is, so many of our problems, we talk about sclerosis in Washington, D.C., so many of our problems stem from that fact. The gerrymandering that became computerized over the past 10, 12 years, where you really can go down to a 9-digit zip code and get every Democrat out of your district if you're a Republican, or every Republican out of your district if you're a Democrat. And what that means is that extremism actually pays. You know, you see a lot of these public interest shows, and they say, why are they acting this way? It's so terrible. No, it's a very logical thing for them to do. They're acting in their best interest. So you have a system where people on talk radio and cable news on both of the extremes act in their self-interest. Say the most extreme things, get the most viewers on each of their sides, and make money. And then you go to the House of Representatives, it's the same thing. So what can be done? You know, state by state by state, I think hopefully you'll have people coming together and figure out a way to reform the system, to cut back on the gerrymandering, because it's absolutely outrageous now what the House of Representatives has turned into, whether Republicans are running it or whether Democrats are running it. That's one of the biggest problems. Term limits and gerrymandering, you take care of those two issues right there, you've taken care of at least half of the problems in the House of Representatives.
Congressman, thank you.
Well, we have one final question, Jon Meacham. Unless it's a tough question, and then I'm late for my next appointment with my dermatologist.
It's not tough.
Okay.
I just want to know, when you were in the House, what Democratic friends did you have that you worked with?
You know, I'm a weird guy. That's not a surprise to anybody that watches my show. I actually, whenever I would go on the House floor, I would always go on the Democratic side. And I would sit on the Democratic side. And it's so funny, when I first got there, people acted like that was strange. And I go back to the Republican side, and they go, what's it like over there? I said, well, the shag carpet looks about the same over there as it does here. But I worked with a lot of people. I worked with Harold Ford on education reform. We both believed in school choice, and so we worked on the education committee. And he upset the ranking member on the Democratic side, and I upset the chairman on the House side, on the Republican side. I actually worked, believe it or not, with Bill Clinton right after impeachment on long-term care. And I was the chairman of the Civil Service Committee. And we wanted to pass a market-based approach to provide long-term care health coverage to federal employees by pooling it, by getting, you know, and giving federal employees a great shot to get good health care at a more affordable price. And I went in there, and I had a committee that I found out kept trying to deep six me, and they'd keep calling Dick Armey, saying this is what he's about to do now. He just called Bill Clinton, and it looks like they. So I just walked in one day, I fired them all. Said, thanks for your service, get out. And I'll actually, because I'd inherited them, and I was nice enough to keep them on. I said, I'll now hire some people that actually want to get something done. And so we passed long-term care. Bill Clinton called it landmark legislation. And actually in my law office, after I got out of Congress, there was a picture of Bill Clinton, and it said, with great appreciation to Joe Scarborough, with warmest regards, Bill Clinton. And all of my liberal law partners would come and go, with great appreciation, you impeached the guy. But that was the thing, though. Yes, we did impeach the guy. But it was the 1990s. It just seemed like the thing to do. But we still got things done. And I think that's the key. You know, I would have breakfast with Barney Frank, talk to him, you know, for an hour and a half about issues that mattered to him, even though we disagreed on 99% of the issues. A guy named Ron Dellums and I, the first day I was in Congress, I sat down with Ron. Ron was, I think he was a Black Panther. He was seen as this radical back in his earlier days. I sat down with him. We had one of the most fascinating conversations I had. And so anytime I had a bill that I needed support from Democrats from, it was pretty easy to do.
Please tell the public that that happened. I think what's happening is we are sick and tired, well, at least I am, and you all are going to start coming here, and I mean everybody who wants to be president.
You all.
You all.
Do you all? You know what? Let me tell you something, lady. Just because I'm from Connecticut, doesn't make me less of an American than you. Are you having a lot of people from Connecticut come in? Is that the problem? Okay. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I need you to be very public about this, that you work on both sides of the aisle. Congressman Ginta, I've asked you many times, you told me, my first thing to you is, who do you work with? And you've told me. People, the public wants to hear that you are working on both sides of the aisle.
Well, and you know, not just the public, but actually Republicans want to hear that from Republicans, and Democrats want to hear that from Democrats. If they really believe that the electorate mirrors what they hear on certain talk radio shows every day, they're badly mistaken. And they're going to be shocked when they start having candidates that are actually not afraid to admit that they'll work with the other side in the best interest for America.
After 9/11, I remember watching and seeing. At that point, you know, there were everybody sort of mixed together a couple of times, and then it stopped.
It stopped.
We have one final one.
So thank you both very much for coming up to New Hampshire on a balmy, almost spring night. And we couldn't let you leave the New Hampshire Institute of Politics without asking about your view of New Hampshire's first in the nation primary status.
Let me think about this. I'm for it. Thank you. I've got to say, it's actually like Christmas Eve to me. I'm one of these political nerds. My parents were always amused when I was like 6 years old on election night. I would trace a map of the country, and then I would color in blue and red whenever a state was called. 1980 was tough because it was all Reagan in about 5 minutes. But I remember the first time I came up to New Hampshire to cover a primary. It's like Christmas Eve. It's incredible. And I love the fact that people actually are engaged in politics the way they are engaged in politics here. And I'm not playing to you at all. I come from a state in Florida that if you want to win statewide, you go inside a back room, you dial, you raise $25 million, and you run 30-second commercials. It's obscene. You know, I got elected in Northwest Florida, and the reason I was the first Republican elected since 1873 is starting on January the 3rd, 1994, I knocked over the next 6 months on 10,000 doors. My opponent had $300,000. I had $30,000 with a month to go. She was ahead of me 45% to 14%. How do I know this? Because she could afford a poll, and we stole it from her. We could afford to do that. And everybody was panicking, and I said, don't worry. I've knocked on 10,000 doors. We're going to run the ads we can afford to run, and we'll be swept over the finish line, and we were. You can do that in New Hampshire. As much as I love my home state of Florida, you can't do that in states like Florida. So I think it's absolutely critical that New Hampshire maintains its place in the process. And I kind of wish we could go back to what it was like in the 70s when the process was actually a little slower. And there were actually the chances, even though a lot of us didn't love what he did when he became president, that a guy like Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, remember that? That crawled through, you know, June and July, and, you know, Carter won. I think it's absolutely essential that people get to look at candidates face to face, because we've seen with Barack Obama and before that George W. Bush, it's one of the last chances that these presidents get to actually look at people in the eye and tell them what they're going to do. So anyway, New Hampshire, I'm for it. Yay. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.